I'm really honored to be here. This is wonderful. I love San Antonio. I'm passionate about military medicine. I started my time doing facilitating military medicine, military medical research over 30 years ago at the now defunct Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center outside of Colorado, outside of Denver, Colorado. I was at the old Army Health Services Command. I served at Brooke Army Medical Center, Landstuhl in Germany, and down in El Paso. I guess I ticked somebody off, so they sent me down there. But I just really feel incredibly blessed to be a part. This conversation, or what we're doing, it's really about you. All I hope ever to do is to facilitate the wonderful work that you folks do. I don't have a lot of passions in the world, but I'm very passionate about military medicine. My oldest daughter and her husband are Air Force doctors out at Nellis Air Force Base. And I all but drove her down to U-Shoes so that she would get in there after she hadn't been accepted into medical school the year before. She didn't think she wanted to be in the military, and now she's in the military. And I'm very proud of that. I'm staying at the Gunter downtown, old place, and this is embarrassing for the many times I've been down here. I've walked the river walk south a number of times, but I'd never walked it north. And what a beautiful, beautiful piece of work that is, going up past the Art Museum. I saw the new Performing Arts Center, which was beautiful. I remember when the symphony used to play downtown in the not so wonderful theater down there, and now they have a beautiful new home. They're great things. And as I was walking north, I was thinking about something that Dr. Hepburn had mentioned. And I may be the oldest guy in the room. I'm embarrassed about that. But back in those days when I was a long-haired, dope-smoking hippie in Berkeley, the U.S. economy was starting to falter. We had come out of World War II, and we were the world's breadbasket. We had a very dynamic economy in nuclear energy, in agriculture, in all areas of technology. But as we spun into the late 70s, we were starting to peter out, and the economies, interestingly enough, of Germany and Japan were on the rise. And there was some serious thought that it would not be too long until those economies were bigger than ours. That's a little bit laughable now, but at the time it was a serious threat. And Congress looked at it. It may have been the last time Congress did anything productive. They looked at the problem and said, well, what's going on here? Why is it that our economy is starting to sputter? And they discovered that the German and the Japanese economies and their governments were doing something that we were not. They were coordinating the activities between their industrial base, their universities, and their government investments in those things. They were coordinating. That's not the American thing to do. We're all lone cowboys and we think we can make it on our own. But in the technology world, it's just too complicated. It's not good enough for government to just give cash to universities to do investments, or to give the money to government labs to try and invent things. Those things have to be commercialized. And that's a whole different realm. That's a whole different business. So beginning in the mid-70s, and this is not my slides, I'm just blobbing around, there were a series of law changes. First was Bayh-Dole, which is the reason most of you are here today, any of you from the university. It allowed the universities to take ownership of the inventions that you create here at UTSA and around the country. And that was a dramatic change. Prior to that time, if the government paid for it, the research, the government owned any inventions that came out of it, which intuitively seemed like a smart idea, except the government doesn't commercialize anything. The government sits on things. The government is slow and bureaucratic and tries to be fair, and by being fair, that means nothing gets done. And then they also passed the Stevenson-Wilder Act, which Dr. Hepburn mentioned, which made it a responsibility of federal research labs to be involved in technology transfer. So as I was walking down the river, I thought, well, this is what we're involved in here. That you represent those communities, the business community, the universities, the government labs, and it's about time we started working together in the way that Congress originally intended, that there be more contact, because it's a contact sport. It takes a lot of work to get these technologies, particularly in the medical realm, because these technologies just take forever to move along, and there's so much failure, and we have to move through failure to finally get those products on the shelf. So blah, blah, blah. That's I don't own nothing. My wife tells me what to say, and my grandchildren run my life. So there you go. I wanted to give you a bottom line about what my presentation is today. There are a number of ways that the military goes about acquiring medical R&D, most of which you are familiar with in one way or another. We do a lot of intramural work at our labs, like at ISR. We have medical labs around the country. We have subunits in Southeast Asia, Africa. So we do a lot of our own work. We have standard government contracts where we pay somebody to do our R&D. We do grants and cooperative agreements. Cooperative agreements are a type of grant where there's substantial involvement with the government, and we have interagency arrangements. I'm not going to talk about those. You're pretty familiar with those, I hope. Putting in my 2 cents worth for the Army's Medical Research and Material Command, our mission to responsibly create, develop, deliver, and sustain medical capabilities for the warfighter, HUA, and our vision, we lead the advancement of military medicine. So that's who we are and what we're about, and a more passionate group would be hard to find. The military medical mission is something that moves our hearts, and we really, I've spent enough time in military hospitals I'm part of it. I'm on board. And we are worldwide. We have not only these official activities around the world, but we do research around the world. The only place we haven't done it that I know of is the North and South Pole. We are in Southeast Asia. We do work in Australia, South America, out in the Pacific. We are everywhere. And I've been involved in negotiating agreements everywhere. So we're concerned. We have to go where the diseases are. We need to work with folks, industry, academia, and government, and we do those agreements everywhere. Okay, I'm going to tell my story, my San Antonio, Alamos City CRADA story. This is a fascinating thing in which I expose my weakness and ignorance from 25 years ago. I was the center judge advocate, that's the chief attorney at Brooke Army Medical Center. At that time, I was probably the expert in military health law and thought myself pretty smart. I got a call from the cardiac service at Brooke Army Medical Center. And somebody gave me this story. They said, hey, A couple of our guys have been working with Johnson & Johnson on a heart stent, which is pretty new technology. And Johnson & Johnson had gotten it through the FDA, but the FDA had said in order for new surgeons to be able to work on this stent, they wanted to make sure that the surgeons saw one procedure and then they were mentored, or somebody with expertise helped them the first time they did it, because you don't want to do those wrong. So they said, is there something that we want to do it here in San Antonio? We have a couple folks at BAMC who are familiar with the technology. They'd worked on the animals, et cetera. Is there something we could do? And I thought the idea was wonderful, but I was stumped as to how we could do it. This was in 1993 time period. So I called the only person I knew in the Army who I thought might know. His name was Jay Winchester. He worked up at Fort Detrick, and I explained the situation. And Jay said, well, Bob, why don't you try a CRADA? And I said, that's great. What's a CRADA? The law had been passed in 1986. The government, being the government, had worked slow. And we went on to do the Army Medical Department's second CRADA. We worked it out. I was so excited to be a part of this and to read the authority. I typed out. We didn't have a template as we do now. I typed out the agreement. And with a few modifications from folks, we made it happen. So I hadn't thought about that for a number of years. And then I was back here in town about 3 years ago at the invitation of the Air Force at a meeting that was up at the Colonnade, and heard a presentation from somebody, I can't remember her name, some of you may know her, she's involved in economic development here, and she was talking about the Julio Palma's stent. Well, for those of you, how many of you know about this stent? If you don't know about it, that Julio Palmas was here at UT. He was from Chile. He came up here, had worked on this, his technology, had a number of patents. This was I guess it's Invention magazine called it one of the top 10 inventions of the last century. This thing was used millions of times every year, and I would bet if you thought about it, most of you know somebody who's had a stent put in, and it really started with Julio Palmas. What I didn't know is that there was an Army inventor. His name was Richard Schatz. And he had patents on this too. And the fellow who owns Fuddruckers here in San Antonio, he started a company with them. Well, the law was such that when Colonel Schatz made that invention was owned by the Army. I wasn't smart enough to ask any questions. I was just so excited about facilitating this CRADA, and I knew so little about intellectual property at that time that it never occurred to me to ask him. And there have been hundreds of millions of dollars in royalties. This technology sold in the billions for 20 years. It's only been in the last half dozen, maybe 8, 9 years, if we have a cardiologist in the room, they could tell you that they've started making changes to the technology, adding materials to it. But this was what I still consider the most important CRADA I've ever done. I've been involved in thousands of them, and it was the stupidest mistake I ever made, because the Army can get those royalties and reinvest it in research. And Richard Schatz has a really beautiful home out on the Pacific coast, and and Julio Palmaz has a wonderful Porsche collection. These gentlemen have made a lot of money. That's fine with me. I don't care. I'm delighted that they did it. But that's my, that was my first CRADA, and now I know the questions to ask. Okay, so what's a CRADA? This is the legal verbiage, and it's essentially, it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of legislation. How often do you hear anyone say that? It's a beautiful piece of legislation that allows government labs to share resources with any non-federal entity, any non-federal entity. They can give materials, they can give people, IP, services. The one thing that the Fed can't give under a CRADA is money. So that's how it distinguishes itself from procurement contracts or grants or other kind of acquisition tools. We don't give out any money. On the other hand, when we work with industry or anyone else who happens to have money, we can take money in. Historically, with just our command, we bring in $25 to $30 million a year, which is really, that may not shock people here in this audience, but for most people, the idea that Uncle Sam is going to bring in money from the outside is very surprising. But we can bring it in, and unless you're Brooke Army Medical Center, which has some accounting problems and not of their own making. These are defense acquisition rules and some fiscal law things. We can keep the money and we could apply it towards the research. And we're going to get around that problem. But this is really fun. I see Cindy's hand going up down there. So this is what we can do, and we do thousands of these. So if you don't know about CRADAs, and I hope you all do, this is a wonderful, fast tool where a procurement contract with the Army, you're talking 18 months. I mean, you know, you get old waiting for that kind of thing. A CRADA we can do in weeks. We've turned them around in 3 hours where the need was there. So it's a quick tool to facilitate research. And if you don't know about this tool, well, talk to your tech transfer office or come talk to me, because it's a beautiful thing. What's a CRADA? It's a kind of contract, but it allows for R&D collaborations between the Fed and non-federal parties. We have local signature authority, so that's really nice. You don't have to go through a contract officer. You don't have to deal with the federal acquisition regulation or all the grants rules. It's much more informal. And when you're dealing with me, it's much more informal because I'm passionate about getting these things done. So that's what we do at Brooke Army Medical Center, ISR. If I have my way, we're going to be doing it with the Air Force and the Navy here in town too. That's a bigger hill to climb, but we're working on it. And we're trying to standardize the processes across DoD. Okay, so it's good to know, for this crowd especially, that if you happen to get some money in from DoD, from where I am up at Fort Detrick, or from NIH, or any government money in, you can still use CRADAs to collaborate with federal labs. And again, that's what we're all here about today is, okay, so we've got some money, but we still want to work with ISR or the Air Force. There's still ways that if the money's coming to you, you can facilitate and work with those labs to do your work. And we can find ways to do that. The law allows it, and good to know. Starting when the Defense Health Agency was created, I started putting together a working group to create a standardized set of formats and rules so that everyone within the DoD medical research enterprise would be working from the same set of rules. That has been at the DHA, the Defense Health Agency Publishing Office now, for long enough for me to get grayer hair. But it will soon go out to the service Surgeon Generals. And we have actually the support of your new headquarters office at the J9, the Research and Development Group. And that's what we're going to do because it was problematic for us to work between the services. That drove me crazy. So we're going to fix that problem before I retire. And that's one of the cool things about a CRADA is that each one should be a one-off. We do have a template because you got to start somewhere. But who owns the data, how the data will be used, who would own any new IP, where would it go? Those things are all worked out up front. And the one rule is that if the Army invents or co-invents a technology and we license it or we assign it to our collaborating partner, the government keeps a government use license. That's the one piece of the law that is we can't change. That's that. However, we can agree on anything else. We can the collaborating party can own the CRADA. We can co-own the CRADA. Excuse me, the data. The government can own it. We put in there provision for publication rights. So all those things are worked out, and how it works out normally depends on who's coming to the table with what. If UTSA has invented something and patented something and they want to work with us on a proof of concept, but they really want to protect their IP because they're the ones who've done most of the sweat on it, well, we can work that out so that if we invent something or co-invent, that we agree to assign it over to you because you're the ones who really have the highest interest in moving it forward through commercialization, etc. So we work that out. We look at each one on their own, and we do it fairly quickly. Now we're going to talk about another acquisition tool that we've begun using in the last couple years. And this is an interesting acquisition instrument that this is how clever the government is. Since it wasn't a procurement contract or a grant, they had to come up with a name for it. And the name they came up with was other transaction. Okay? And that's what they call it. And these are other transaction agreements, so you'll hear them called OTs or OTAs. And it's a type of funding agreement, but it's one that they use at DARPA a lot. There are a number of technology areas and labs that now have this authority. And essentially, it's a partnering agreement where the government is going to put forward some of the money. How much of the money really depends on who we're partnering with. The idea is we use other transactions when we're trying to develop a prototype. Prototype is very broadly defined, and this is for particularly those at UTSA who are working on devices of any type, including IT, algorithms, things like that, where we know that there's going to be a commercial market. Okay, a number of the things we develop have very small, almost non-existent markets outside of the military. This is a new way to get small companies involved in working with the government. Companies that, because of either lack of experience or they just, the last thing in the world they want to do is get involved in a federal acquisition regulation type contract, to have a government-approved accounting system, etc. It's just not worth the trouble for small, dynamic technology companies to get into that space. They can make plenty of money on the outside. The problem is the government wants their brains. We want to have the best cutting-edge technology for the US government. So OTAs were created as a way to attract these kind of companies to work with us. We want them to have some skin in the game. We'll put some skin in the game. And there's more negotiating space as to how we're going to move forward should the research pan out positively. So we look for small businesses, non-traditional contractors. What that means in essence is we aren't looking for the big boys, Boeing, Raytheon, etc. We will work with them in some circumstances, but normally they have to put in a lot more of the money. And this kind of tool works much quicker than a standard procurement contract. So that should excite those of you who have gone gray waiting for that grant money to come forward. We can do this in a matter of a few months instead of 18 months. So this is a new tool to learn about. And we set it up at our headquarters by contracting with a not-for-profit that was created exactly for this purpose. MTEC stands for Military Technology Enterprise Corporation. In fact, we came up with this unfortunate name. And it's made up of academic institutions. I assume UTSA is a member?
UT Health and UTSA.
Okay, our members, there are small firms. There's a number here in San Antonio and around the country. There's big companies. At this point, I think there's about 150 organizations, and they're looking to grow and expand to attract companies as the different types of technologies are brought in. Those who, for example, are interested in hearing technology, the companies that are involved in that space are different than the ones that are in the prosthetic field, are different than in epithelial cell space, for example. So as we go out with new proposals, or as people come to us, we use this not-for-profit to go out and find new partners, and it's pretty cheap to get in. It's a couple grand. It's not going to drive anyone broke. But if you're a member of MTech, you get earlier notice of the opportunities. You can get some more training in it. So there's some advantages to it. And again, why this is so fun is that it's a lot more flexible. The government can work closer with MTech and with MTech members to talk directly about what we're looking for. Unlike the procurement contract space where there's this arm's length relationship between the government through the government contracting officer and the various entities that are applying, through MTech, we can talk face-to-face with folks about what more exactly we're looking for. And we can collaborate in that way. And as I mentioned earlier, we can have multiple agreements. Our first agreement under this other transaction authority, we actually are working with a small San Antonio firm who's working with ISR through a CRADA. In fact, all the partners that are involved in helping to develop this are working with ISR. It's a beautiful kind of agreement that we got from announcement to award in, I think it was about 6 months. And again, for government, that is really moving. One of the pieces of this legislation which allows us to do other transactions is that if the prototype is actually working If we've developed it and we've worked, and we can give a sole source contract for manufacturing and sales to the government. So I wanted to throw that out there. So the technologies can be at various development, technology readiness levels. If the problem is, well, some of this is at X level, but part of it is Y level, I would make the case that what we're trying to do the prototyping on is the software or this aspect of it. Some parts of it are more developed, but the problem that needs to be worked on for the military is the X, which is at level 3 and not level 6 or 7. The one thing that interested me from what you said is it sounded like this was just one company or one enterprise. And really one of the things that they're trying to do with OTAs, distinct from our standard contracts or even grants, is we're trying to find teams of organizations, even private sector organizations, to work together on this. The idea is that the more brains, the better, and that those companies and universities who are going to be working together have to decide up front, okay, if this works, who's going to own how much of what? Is everyone willing to actually put their IP into the pot? Who's giving money here? And who's the sugar daddy from the private enterprise group that wants to put some skin in the game? And part, again, if we're looking at the bigger picture of these other transactions, we're hoping that there's somebody within your group who's willing to put some skin into it, because although the government might end up buying it, it's going to probably cost a pot of money to set up some kind of manufacturing facility. The regulatory end is quite costly. We can sometimes help with that. But again, the idea is that with these kind of agreements, that we're dealing with people on the outside who are going to be of a mind to take it all the way to commercial production. One of the problems we've had historically is we'll give a lot of grants out, we get reports in, and then that's where things die. And that's what this kind of agreement is intended to overcome, so that instead of the government just buying a study, we're working with others to create the prototype, again, with the hope that they will run with it. Do we need more money for advanced development? Well, that could be a shared burden. It shouldn't just fall on the government, particularly if people have done their numbers right and they can see that this is a $100 million a year kind of business. Well, there should be somebody interested in the private sector with some dollars behind them and some experience to help move it along. So I really see the day when the San Antonio business community, along with UTSA and the other universities locally and BAMC, that this is going to be one way that we're going to start seeing some products out here. We're going to see Jose will be so filthy rich because this is the way to move those things. This is the way to take those ideas and to push them, to accelerate them, and hopefully we'll get to the point where government is not the obstacle to moving these technologies, and we're doing more than simply throwing checks at it, that we're actually participating as team members in a process that goes from conception all the way to on the shelf. Okay, these are just some examples, and the point of it is to show you both the breadth of what we're doing with other transactions, but also the speed of it. that most of these can be done within 6 months, which is a reasonable amount of time from putting out a program announcement, getting in applications, looking at the options, and providing the awards. And we do have the equivalent of a broad agency announcement that we can work. It's called a multi-topic solicitation. For those of you in the grant world, it's the same as a broad area announcement. You can put in your applications because you think, yeah, I think the X or Y would be of interest, and we can make awards. If we can find money for it, we can make awards, yes. Here's some more. It goes on and on. I'm excited about this. This is something else that I was stupid about at the beginning. When the idea of these other transactions came up, and it was first presented to us, and this would have been about 4 years ago, myself, my boss, one other attorney in the office, we're in there and we left shaking our heads saying, this will never work. This is just too stupid. You know, what kind of technologies do we have that we want to use this kind of mechanism? And fortunately, I was dead wrong. We're coming up with lots of different ways to use this mechanism, and it's very dynamic. So it's an exciting piece of news. I think it's exciting for groups like the university, because it's a way that you can team up front with small enterprises that you can lend your brains in that way. So it's really cool. Bless you. Thank you. Best of luck to all of you.